discussed about the impersonality of the poet, that he advocated that a poet or an artist must be impersonal and his personality should not be expressed through his art. So today we will discuss his second essay, that is Hamlet and his problems, which is dealing with his concept of objective correlative. But this objective correlative is having some relationship with the impersonality theory. So here also he is presenting his impersonality theory, but in the extended manner. So how he begins this part of the essay, as we have found in the book, because we have not been given the whole essay, but the part of the essay. So he is telling that the younger poets of England and America, I am sure that their admiration for Yeats's poetry has been wholly good. So Eliot is appreciating the younger poets of America and England for their admiration of Yeats, W.B. Yeats, and he is telling that the work and the man himself as poet have been of the greatest significance to them for all that. He is telling both W.B. Yeats, the man, and his work, both have been of greatest significance to these young poets. So now what happens? Yesterday we discussed about the impersonality, where the poet has to dissociate his personality from the work of art. But now Eliot is telling that both the work of art as well as the man as a poet, they are having great significance for the young poets in molding them, in influencing them. So how it could be? It looks contradictory. And he is also telling that he is talking those things which can be same time he is telling that actually it is contradicting. How? In page 14 he is telling that there are two forms of impersonality, that which is natural to the mere skillful craftsman, and that which is more and more achieved by the maturing artist. So he is talking about two types of impersonality. One is the impersonality in the form of poetry as a craftsman, and the second one is the maturing artist. That means the artist as a person achieving impersonality. The first is that what I have called the anthology piece of a lyric by Lovelace or Suckling, or of Campion, a finer poet than either. He is giving the example of the metaphysical poets, the poets uh, like Lovelace and Suckling, John Suckling or Campion. And he's telling that these poets, they had achieved impersonality in their craftsmanship. From the craftsmanship, nobody can tell that this style of writing belongs to Suckling or Lovelace or Campion. That means impersonality in the craftsmanship of poetry, in the structure of the poetry, in its lyric, in its musicality, etc. And the second impersonality is that of the poet who, out of intense and personal experience, is able to express a general truth, retaining all the particularity of his experience to make of it a general symbol. And the second type of impersonality is that where the poet is becoming mature in achieving impersonality in relating to a general truth. He is not giving us a personal truth, a personal experience. And his presentation becomes a general symbol. Even if he is telling or relating a personal experience, it becomes a general symbol or a general truth. You can take, for example, any of the romantic poets of Elizabethan period. When the poet is telling to his beloved, do not go to attend the spring season because the cuckoo has not invited you. So it is no more a personal, it is a general feeling, it is a general emotion. So he is now dividing, Eliot is now dividing impersonality into craftsmanship and the experience or the truth. Then he is telling in page number 15, the only way of expressing emotion in the form of art is by finding an objective correlative. So, if there are two forms of impersonality, how a good poet or the artist can achieve both? Because if an artist will fail to achieve both, the artist cannot be a great one. So he is suggesting there is the way of expressing emotion in the form of art is by finding an objective correlative. This is his theory of objective correlative, that how the emotion can be universal, how the emotion can be a general truth. It is through objective correlative. What is objective correlative? It is a set of objects, a situation, a chain of events which shall be the formula of that particular emotion, such that when the external facts which must terminate in sensory experience are given, the emotion is immediately evoked. That means the poet has to make a selection or choice of a set of objects. You can take, for example, the small lyric of Wordsworth, uh, that uh, solitary reaper. The poet compares that song of the solitary reaper, of that solitary girl who was singing while cutting the crops, with that of the songs of the nightingales in a desert or in spring somewhere. Or and he is also comparing it with some other songs. Similarly, in Shelley also, in Shelley's poem the Skylark song is compared with 5 to 6 objects. He's comparing the song of Skylark to that of the glowworms in a dark night, to that of a princess singing the song of sadness in her bower, that to so many things. So, what happens? These are the set of objects. The poet is comparing his feelings, his emotions with these set of objects, identifying them with this series of objects, and thus creating what? Creating a particular emotion. And the reader going through these objects presented in the poetry is visualizing in his senses, in his mind, in his imagination, and is able to catch what exactly the poet is feeling or the poet is trying to convey. Suppose, come for another mundane, very ordinary experience. A patient comes to the doctor and tells, "Sir, I am having a great pain or a headache." The doctor is asking, "What type of headache?" because I have to know exactly how you feel. The patient is telling that, sir, it is just like somebody hammered me from the back of my head. So look at this thing. The patient is giving an example of an object. The doctor is going to that object. The doctor is listening to the patient, but doctor's mind is going to that object of the hammer. As the hammer crashes against the head, that is the pain. So here what happened? The objective correlative is taking place. And the doctor immediately grasps the intensity of suffering on the part of the patient. So Eliot is telling that that is the method of bringing in the emotion or evoking the emotion on the part of the poet or the artist. And he is giving example of Macbeth from Shakespeare's drama to explain that. You can read that. The artistic inability lies in this complete adequacy of the external to the emotion, and this is precisely what is deficient in Hamlet. And he is telling in Macbeth, Shakespeare is able to have that objective correlative when wife of Macbeth, Lady Macbeth, is giving so many objects in relating the suffering. But in Hamlet, that is deficient. Hamlet is not able to communicate in this way. Therefore, Hamlet's suffering cannot be deciphered by the audience or the reader sufficiently. And therefore, Eliot is of view that Shakespeare has an artistic problem in Hamlet. So you can remember it for objective question. The question can be asked that in which play of Shakespeare the objective correlative is deficient. So it is Hamlet, because Hamlet is unable to relate his sufferings through any objectives. Therefore, his suffering is not conveyed properly either to his mother or to his beloved or to anyone else, even to his closest friend. Therefore, Hamlet is a great tragedy. Then in page 16, the second paragraph, the madness of Hamlet lay to Shakespeare's hand in the earlier play a simple ruse, and to the end, we may presume, understood as a ruse by the audience. So he is telling Shakespeare has taken this ruse or the trick, and by this trick of not relating through objectives, Shakespeare has created a great drama. Hamlet is considered as the masterpiece. Why? Because it is not conveying the exactitude of suffering, the exactitude of emotion on the part of the protagonist. And the reader or the audience are given a space to go through, to fill in with their imagination. And later on, he is elaborating the intense feeling, ecstatic or terrible, without an object or exceeding its object, is something which every person of sensibility has known. It is doubtless a subject of study for pathologists. So he is telling that intense feeling, it may be ecstatic or it may be terror or fear, apprehension, without an object or exceeding its subject, is something that every person of sensibility has known. That means we all know exactly what is the intensity of our feeling. But the moment we have to express it, we have to relate it before someone else, we take the help of certain exterior objects. Take for example, again, if if somebody is feeling that he is very much afraid of this particular situation, the pandemic, then his friends are consoling, why you are terrified? He's telling, no, you see, I have dreams in my sleep. I can't go to sleep for more than half an hour. I can't concentrate on my study. I can't do this. I can't watch TV. So, what is happening? We are giving a series of objectives to relate what exactly we are feeling, the intensity of our suffering or the intensity of our ecstasy or happiness. So, in this way, Eliot is telling that every poet, every artist must have that objective correlative. So, in this way, what happens? He has joined the impersonal theory with objective correlative. Okay. Now, we'll be going to his third essay, The Metaphysical Poets. And from this part of the essay, this is also not the whole essay, but the part of that essay. From this essay, Eliot is going to talk about the dissociation of sensibility. Means sensibility, you know. So, how the sensibility got dissociated, what he means by dissociation of sensibility. And I want to remind you that I told you about this dissociation of sensibility while I was discussing Coleridge. And already I have told you that there are certain developments from Coleridge in Eliot. Eliot and Coleridge, you will find certain relationship. In spite of Eliot being a classical critic, particularly rejecting romantic critical theories, but he is rejecting the theory of Wordsworth more than Coleridge. So, in this part of the essay, you will find he is beginning with Andrew Marvell's Coy Mistress and Richard Crosser's Saint Teresa, and he's giving that example, love thou art absolute sole Lord of life and death. So, he is beginning from the metaphysical poets by telling that the metaphysical poets were different from their immediate predecessors, the Elizabethan poets. And how they differed from the Elizabethan poets? The Elizabethan poets were romantic poets, they were free flowing poets of emotion and passion. But metaphysical poets were the poets of intellect, analysis. They had both analysis, intellect, as well as emotion and passion, because they also belong to that particular age. So passion and emotion was there, but emotion and passion was dominated by the power of rationality analysis. Therefore, he is telling that their attempts were always analytic. They were always analytical. You will go through it. I am not going through it because it will take time. But I am coming to page number 19. He is telling a thought to dawn was an experience. It modified his sensibility. So, this is the comment, that a thought to dawn was an experience. Look at this statement. How come a thought will be experience? Experience is something which we do in our life, we go through in our life, and thought which comes initially to our mind. But he's telling Dawn as a poet always gave precedence to the thought, or the idea, and that modified his sensibility. His poetic sensibility is modified by the thought. When a poet's mind is perfectly equipped for its work, it is constantly amalgamating disparate experience. The ordinary man's experience is chaotic, irregular, fragmentary. Again, you go back to Coleridge. Coleridge told about primary and secondary imagination is universal. So every ordinary man is having that primary imagination, but the primary imagination is chaotic, irregular, fragmentary. I told you that the primary imagination stores all the experiences in categories. So Eliot is also telling the same thing, that ordinary man's experience is chaotic, irregular, fragmentary. The ordinary man cannot relate one experience with another or one category of experience with another. He presents it in a very chaotic manner. But whereas the poet is perfectly equipped to constantly amalgamate, means blending. Coleridge used the word blending and Eliot is using the word amalgamate experience. Disparate means diversified, different experiences. Coleridge said that the poet or the artist will blend the different experiences from the primary imaginations into a new whole, a new entity. And Eliot is telling the same thing by telling that the poet's mind is perfectly equipped for its work. It is constantly amalgamating disparate experiences. The latter falls in love or reads Spinoza, and these two experiences have nothing to do with each other or with the noise of the typewriter or smell of cooking. In the mind of the poet, these experiences are always forming new wholes. So, the second person means the ordinary man. Someone is cooking as well as he is listening to the sound of the typewriter. The ordinary man will find it distracting or disturbing. But the poet can blend both these two different sounds, the smell of the cooking with the sound of the typewriter, to form a poem. Then in the next paragraph he is telling the poets of 17th century, the successors of the dramatist of the 16th, possessed a mechanism of sensibility which could devour any kind of experience. So he is telling the poets of 17th century means the metaphysical poets who followed the successors of the dramatist of the 16th century, the followers of the Elizabethan period. They had a mechanism according to Eliot. What mechanism? Mechanism of sensibility that could devour any kind of experience. They could observe any kind of experience. They were not differentiating between one and another. Elizabethan poets, classical poets, they were very selective. They were selecting words, selecting visions, selecting experiences for particular poetic sensibility. But for metaphysical poet, any experience is an experience for poetry. So they were able to have that sensibility which could devour any kind of experience. They are simple, artificial, difficult, or fantastic as their predecessors were. No less nor more than Dante, Guido, Cavalcanti, Guinicelli, or Sino. In the 17th century, a dissociation of sensibility set in from which we have never recovered. So he is telling that 17th century poets, they used all sorts of experience into poetry. For them, nothing was unpoetic. Previously, there were unpoetic words, unpoetic imageries, unpoetic experiences, but in metaphysical poetry, nothing was unpoetic. Everything was poetic. Therefore, he is comparing them with the classical poets like Dante, Cavalcanti, or Sino. That these classical poets, they were also having such type of sensibility where they could use different contrasting experiences into poetic sensibility. But in this very 17th century, that means just after the metaphysical poets, Eliot is telling dissociation of sensibilities cropped in, and from that English poetry never recovered. Though the romantic poets and classical poets, they were selective about poetic images, poetic language, but they were also using the thought and emotion equally. For them, the thought can be converted into an emotion, and emotion can be expressed in the form of a thought. And the metaphysical poets brought it more contrastingly. But they had that association of sensibility. They had both the sensibility, the rational sensibility, the thoughts, as well as the emotions. But after them, the post metaphysical English poetry suffered from the dissociation of sensibility. Why? Because you know the Puritanic movement. The Puritanic movement destroyed this association of sensibility. In page 20, he is telling the language went on and in some respects improved. The best verse of Collins, Gray, Johnson, and even Goldsmith satisfies some of our fastidious demands better than that of Donne or Marvell or King. But while the language became more refined, the feeling became more crude. The feeling, the sensibility expressed in the country churchyard is cruder than that of the coy mistress. So Eliot is telling that from the physical poetry or just after the metaphysical poetry, the dissociation of sensibility started. But the metaphysical poets were having both the sensibilities. But after that, Milton, though a great poet, was not having that blend of sensibility. Milton was not having the thought, he was having great uh, feeling, great imagination. And then came your Pope and other poets for whom it was only rationality, only thought. Dryden and Pope, they championed thought, no feelings, no emotion, no passion. So English poetry suffered from the lacking of one sensibility or the other in the subsequent ages. And he's talking about the revival of romanticism in last part of 18th century, and he's telling even in that period poets like uh, Gray and others, they had great feelings but they didn't have thought. And the Victorian poets like Tennyson, they also suffered. Tennyson was more sentimental, but the other sensibility was lacking. And he is going on elaborating. The second effect of the influence of Milton and Dryden followed from the first and was therefore slow in the manifestation. So he is telling that why in Milton and Dryden's poetry we couldn't find the blending of both sensibilities, and why it is not remarkable, because Milton was a great poet of imagination and Dryden was also classically influenced, but still then their poetry lacked the blending of both sensibility. The poets revolted against the ratiocinative, the descriptive, they thought and felt by fits, unbalanced, reflected. So the poets of this period, like Dryden and Pope, they revolted against ratiocinative, the descriptive, and their poetry became unbalanced. And thereafter, the poets who came, they simply reflected. Poets like the romantic poets of Wordsworth, Shelley. Shelley's triumph of life in the second Hyperion, there are traces of a struggle towards unification of sensibility. But Keats and Shelley died, and Tennyson and Browning ruminated. So he's telling that Keats and Shelley could have unified it, but they died without achieving it. And again, Tennyson and Browning, they simply ruminated. They became sentimental. Their poetry became sentimental without proper feelings or emotion. After this brief exposition of a theory, too brief perhaps to carry conviction, we may ask what would have been the fate of the metaphysical had the current of poetry descended in a direct line from them as it descended in a direct line to them. So he is telling that what would have happened to the metaphysical poets if they would have come after the Elizabethan poetry without revolting against it. He is telling that the possible interests of a poet are unlimited. The more intelligent he is, the better. The more intelligent he is, more likely that he will have interests. Our only condition is that he turn them into poetry and not merely meditate on them poetically. So, a good poet, a great poet, he may have interest on unlimited subjects, and he may have great intelligence, because intelligence also helps, but he should convert them into poetry. A philosophical theory which has entered into poetry is established for its truth or falsity, in one sense creates ceases to matter, and is truth in another sense is proved. And he is giving one example, that suppose a philosophical theory is being taken by a poet, and the poet has to convert, has to transform that philosophy, that abstract philosophy, into the poetic sense or the poetic truth. Otherwise, that will remain incomplete, imperfect. They were at best find the verbal equivalent for states of mind and feeling. And this means both that they are more mature and they hear better than later poets of certainly not less literary ability. And he's talking about poets of the Victorian period like Arnold and others, who talked much about states of mind, but they were unable to convert the states of mind or the thoughts in their mind into the emotion or the feelings. Therefore, English poetry remained imperfect, remained divorced or dissociated from both the sensibilities. In the final paragraph, he is telling it is not a permanent necessity that poets should be interested in philosophy or in any other subject. We can only say that it appears likely that poets in our civilization as it exists at present must be difficult. So he is telling in 20th century, Eliot feels that it is a critical time. The poets should not remain only with philosophy, because 20th century witnessed world wars. It is a chaotic period. It shattered human beliefs in its history, in its humanism in its knowledge, etc. Therefore, the poet has to devour all sorts of experiences, different kinds of experiences, and convert them into poetic feelings. 20th century will not allow any poet of dissociation of sensibility to sustain, because 20th century itself is a period of multiple sensibilities. Therefore, he is telling our civilization comprehends great variety and complexity, and this variety and complexity, playing upon a refined sensibility, must produce various and complex results. So, because 20th century is a complex period, having so much of variety and complexity, so that must be refined into sensibility. The poet must become more and more comprehensive, more elusive, more indirect, in order to force, to dislocate, if necessary, more indirect language into his meaning. Therefore, Eliot wants that in 20th century, at least the English poets should be more comprehensive. Comprehensive means they should bring in both the sensibilities into work, and more elusive. The thoughts should not be verbal presentation. The thoughts should be exhibited or expressed through the allusions, the objective correlative, and more indirect in order to force. Force means it is the force of the emotion or the passion, and it should come from the indirectness of allusion. When the poet will be giving the allusion, the poet can give the intensity. Again, if we go back to some poet, the poet is trying to give the emotion, or come back to that example of the patient. The patient is telling, Mr. Doctor, I am having severe pain. The doctor is telling, no, you don't have much pain, you can take this. But the patient is going on narrating, no, no, you don't know, I am having this, I am loving this. Sometimes I feel as if my head will falling down. So one after another, indirect suggestiveness forces the doctor to realize how much I suffer. So the poet in modern times, in 20th century, must also do that. Through objective correlative, he should bring in the association between thought and emotion, to dislocate, if necessary, more indirect language into its meaning. And the modern poet or 20th century poet must also dissociate or dislocate the language into his meaning. The language is the thought, the language is the verbal idea, but that language has to be dislocated, the language has to be melted, the language has to be evaporated into some meaning. The moment the poet says, oh my dot dot dot, the reader should feel. The reader should not expect, like you people sometimes, sir, what is the fill in the blank? The fill in the blank has to be given from the reader. So that is the association of sensibility. So T.S.Eliot is a great advocate of association of sensibility, and he is critical of English poetry from metaphysical poets till Victorian poet as incomplete poet. I hope you can follow this properly, and if you have any doubt, you can put the questions.